9 years on air. 9 seasons of a fictional Virginia family that somehow became more real to American audiences than most of their actual neighbors. And yet, one by one, the people who made that family feel real walked away from it, some by choice, some because life gave them no other option, and some because the show itself changed faster than they could keep up with. This is the story of why the faces of Walton's mountain disappeared, one at a time, until the mountain itself was almost unrecognizable. When The Waltons premiered on CBS in the fall of 1972, nobody in the industry expected it to survive. It was a slow, quiet drama about a Depression-era family in rural Virginia, competing against flashier programming, and network executives reportedly considered canceling it after its first season due to lackluster early ratings. But something happened that television rarely sees: word of mouth. Viewers connected with the sincerity of Earl Hamner Jr.'s semi-autobiographical vision, and by its second season, The Waltons was a certified hit, eventually becoming one of the most beloved family dramas of its era. But the very qualities that made the show work, its rhythm, its family structure, its slow-burn emotional storytelling, were also what made it so fragile. When a single actor left, the entire architecture of the show had to bend around the absence. And over 9 seasons it bent again and again. The first major departure, and arguably the most consequential, was Richard Thomas, who played John Boy Walton, the eldest son, and the emotional narrator of the entire series. Thomas was the show's central figure in almost every sense. His character's voiceovers bookend nearly every episode, and his journey from aspiring writer to published author mirrored the show's own narrative backbone. For 5 seasons, Thomas carried that weight, and by the mid-1970s, he had become one of the most recognizable young actors on American television, earning an Emmy Award for the role in 1973. But by 1977, after the show's 5th season, Thomas made the decision to leave. His reasoning, as he explained in interviews over the years, centered on a desire to expand his career beyond a single character he had now played for half a decade, and to pursue film and stage work that he felt was creatively necessary at that stage of his life. He was also, by his own account, ready to start a family of his own, and the demands of a weekly television schedule made that difficult to balance. It wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a falling out. It was simply an actor in his late 20s recognizing that the role which made him famous could also become the role that defined the limits of his career if he stayed too long. Thomas's departure forced the production into a decision that many long-running family dramas eventually face: recast or write the character out. CBS chose recasting, bringing in Robert Whiteman to take over the role of John Boy for the show's 6th season. It was a bold and, in hindsight, a risky move, asking audiences who had spent 5 years watching Richard Thomas embody a character to accept someone new in his place. Whiteman has spoken candidly in later interviews about how difficult that transition was, both for him as a performer stepping into an already beloved role and for the audience, some of whom never fully accepted the change. Ratings for the show, while still respectable, never quite reached the heights they had during Thomas's tenure, and many longtime viewers openly said in fan correspondence and later retrospectives that the show never fully recovered its earlier magic once its narrative voice changed hands. It's a reminder of something television producers still grapple with today. Audiences don't just watch actors, they watch relationships they've built with those actors over time, and those relationships are not easily transferable. But if Richard Thomas's exit was a story of ambition and timing, the departure of Will Geer, who played Grandpa Zebulon Walton, was a story with no choice involved at all. Geer was already an accomplished stage and screen actor by the time he joined the Waltons, having survived the Hollywood blacklist era of the 1950s due to his political associations, a period of his life that had nearly ended his career decades earlier. On the show, his portrayal of the wise, weathered patriarch became one of its emotional cornerstones, offering a grounded warmth that balanced the more sentimental tones of the younger cast members. Geer continued working on the series into its later seasons even as his health began to decline, and in April of 1978, he passed away due to respiratory failure. He was 76 years old. The production made the difficult decision to write his death into the show's narrative rather than simply recasting or ignoring the loss, allowing Grandpa Walton's death to be portrayed within the story itself during the show's 7th season. It was a rare moment where the fictional world and the real world collided directly on screen, and for the cast and crew, many of whom had grown close to Geer over years of filming together, it was reportedly one of the most emotionally difficult periods of production the show ever experienced. Ellen Corby, who played Grandma Esther Walton opposite Geer, faced her own health crisis that altered the trajectory of her time on the show, though in her case, she managed something remarkable. She came back. In 1976, Corby suffered a serious stroke that left her with significant physical and speech difficulties, forcing her to step away from filming for an extended period. For a time, it seemed uncertain whether she would return to the role at all. But Corby, showing the same resilience audiences associated with her character, worked through rehabilitation and eventually returned to the Waltons in a reduced capacity, with the show's writers adjusting Grandma's storylines to reflect her real recovery, including scenes depicting the character dealing with the aftermath of a stroke. It was an unusually honest choice for network television at the time, folding an actress's real physical struggle into her character's fictional one, and it gave audiences a rare, unfiltered look at resilience that went beyond scripted drama. Corby remained with the show in various capacities until it ended in 1981, and her performance during that period is still remembered as one of quiet, hard-won courage. Michael Learned, who portrayed the family's matriarch Olivia Walton, left the series under circumstances that were more personal and creative than medical. Learned had won 3 Primetime Emmy Awards for her portrayal of Olivia by the time she made the decision to step back from the role in its later seasons, reducing her presence and eventually departing the show before its conclusion. In interviews given across the years since, Learned has spoken about wanting to avoid becoming permanently defined by a single character, expressing a desire to take on more varied and challenging work as an actress rather than remaining tied to the gentle, nurturing image of Olivia Walton for the rest of her career. There were also narrative adjustments made to accommodate her reduced involvement. The show wrote in a storyline where Olivia contracted tuberculosis and had to leave the family home for treatment, which conveniently allowed the character, and by extension the actress, to step back from the show's day-to-day storylines without requiring a permanent recasting. It was a graceful solution to a real production challenge, one that allowed the show to continue honoring the character's importance while accommodating an actress who had simply outgrown, in her own words, the confines of the role. Ralph Waite, who played John Walton Sr., the steady head of the household, had a different relationship with his departure altogether. Waite remained one of the most consistent presences on the show for most of its run, but he was also deeply interested in expanding into directing, and he took on directorial duties for several episodes of The Waltons during its later seasons, a common path for established actors looking to grow creatively within a show they were already committed to. Waite's character was written out for a period near the end of the series, with the storyline explaining his absence as an extended work trip, which allowed Waite the flexibility to pursue additional projects and reduced his weekly filming commitments without requiring a permanent goodbye. Unlike some of his castmates, Waite's transition away from the show was less about personal ambition to leave entirely and more about renegotiating how much of his time the production required, a privilege that came with his seniority on set and his growing interest in work behind the camera. Then there were the children, and by the time The Waltons reached its later seasons, they weren't children anymore. Judy Norton, who played Mary Ellen, John Walmsley, who played Jason, Mary McDonough, who played Aaron, Eric Scott, who played Ben, David W. Harper, who played Jim Bob, and Cami Codler, who played Elizabeth, all grew up in real time on screen, something few television families have ever done so visibly. As the actors aged into their late teens and early 20s, many of them began pursuing interests outside the confines of a weekly family drama. John Walmsley, for instance, was deeply passionate about music and used his time on the show to also develop a career as a singer-songwriter, occasionally stepping back from full-time filming to focus on that pursuit. Judy Norton similarly balanced her acting commitments with an emerging interest in music and other creative projects as she got older. Mary McDonough has spoken in later years about the particular pressures of growing up as a young actress on a hit show, including struggles with body image and self-perception that came from being a teenage girl constantly viewed and judged on camera, struggles she has written and spoken about candidly in the decades since the show ended. These weren't dramatic exits filled with conflict. They were the natural result of young performers reaching adulthood and needing, as any young adult does, to figure out who they wanted to be outside of the identity the show had given them since childhood. By the time The Waltons entered its final seasons, the show barely resembled the ensemble that had captivated audiences in 1972. Richard Thomas was gone, replaced by an actor many viewers never fully embraced. Will Geer had passed away, his death written permanently into the show's history. Michael Learned had scaled back her involvement before eventually departing. Ralph Waite had shifted much of his energy toward directing. And the children who had once anchored the show's emotional core were adults now, some drifting toward other pursuits, others simply outgrowing the format that had once defined their entire public identity. CBS ultimately made the decision to end the series in 1981, after 9 seasons, a decision that came as the show's original creative team had, in many ways, already scattered across new projects, new ambitions, and in Will Geer's case, into memory alone. What's striking, looking back at all of this decades later, is how ordinary most of these departures actually were. There was no great scandal at the heart of The Waltons. There was no bitter feud that tabloids feasted on for years. What happened to this cast was simply what happens to almost every long-running ensemble in television history. People grow, people change, people get sick, people age, and people eventually want different things than the ones they wanted when the show began. Richard Thomas wanted a broader career. Michael Learned wanted creative range beyond a single archetype. Ralph Waite wanted to direct. The child actors wanted to become adults on their own terms. And Will Geer, tragically, simply ran out of time. None of it diminishes what the show accomplished, and in many ways, it deepens it, because The Waltons was never really about a perfect, unchanging family. It was about a family that endured hardship, loss, growth, and change, and held together anyway. In the end, the cast that brought that story to life lived out something remarkably similar behind the cameras. They changed. They grew apart from the show, and sometimes from each other. But for 9 years, they gave millions of viewers something rare, a mirror of resilience, filmed in real time, by people who were living their own version of that same lesson long after the cameras stopped rolling. And perhaps that's the quiet, enduring truth behind why they left, not because the mountain stopped meaning something to them, but because, like all of us eventually must,